Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Mark on RC Nerd 74. In today's episode of my RC Scrappy build, I'm gonna talk about a few different topics. First is the progress on the shocks. I removed the paint on the shocks. Then I went on with the shock mount on the fuselage side. Also started to build the mounts on the double wishbone side. And did some progress on the tail wheel. So a lot of topics to talk about, so let's jump right into the details and have a closer look on the build steps. There was a little disappointment about the shocks, about the assembling of the shocks. You cannot disassemble the whole shocks, so what I had to do to remove the paint with sanding, I had to tape the whole chrome cylinder of the shocks just to avoid scratches on the shocks, and had to sand down the paint during the shocks were assembled. When the chrome cylinder was masked, I first sanded down the pivot point area of the shocks with my Dremel tool, then put the shocks into my drill and sanded down the whole cylinder on the drill with some 240 grit sandpaper and wet sanded with 400 sandpaper just to get a pretty nice finish. I didn't remove the whole paint, there is some little bit of paint left. This will be removed later during the build when the whole raw build of the plane is done. The reason why I didn't use chemicals to remove the paint is that I want to use as few chemicals as possible to get a more scale look of the suspension of the shock mount on the fuselage side. I decided to do 3 separate mounts on each side. So the center part is a whole shock bridge which goes through the whole fuselage. This is a step I did in my last video, and the side parts you can see here, these are added in the last few steps. This is for the look in first place, and it also adds a little more strength to the whole shock mount. To get the same shape as the center plate for the 2 outer plates, I removed the shocks and took some carton and drew the template onto the carton, so I had the exact template to get the same shape of these 2 plates in comparison to the center one. I also took 1.5mm carbon plates, I masked them and cutted the shape with my Dremel tool, just a raw shape. Then I drilled some additional holes to get the exact same shape on all 4 plates. I screwed the whole plates together with 2 screws, so I had a stack of 4 plates, cutted them to the exact same length and sanded them to the shape you can see here, and they go around 4 centimeters into the fuselage. The whole plates look exactly the same after shaping the whole 4 plate stack. After the shaping was done, I sanded all the edges to get smooth edges, and the edge which will be pulled into the fuselage, I sharpened this edge just to make it easier to put it into the cut into the fuselage later after open the fuselage with a knife. I also drilled some additional holes into the plates just to remove some weight, and sanded the areas which are hidden by the fuselage with 150 grit sandpaper to improve the grip for the 24-hour epoxy which I use to glue the plates into the fuselage. Then I masked the area on the fuselage where I had to do the cuts, drawed all the positions for the plates, for the cuts where the plates go into the fuselage. After all the marks were done, I took a hobby knife and cut these areas deep into the fuselage so the whole plates can go into the fuselage just with this little part visible. To make the cuts a little wider, I used two files, a thinner one and a wider one, just to open up the cuts a little more, so the 1.5mm carbon plate can be put pretty easy into the fuselage. Then I did a test installation of the plates just to check if everything fits. Didn't use any epoxy for this test installation and all fitted pretty well. So I used my 24-hour epoxy, put it onto the plates and also a bit onto the gaps on the fuselage and slided the plates into the fuselage. To let the plates cure into the perfect position, I reinstalled the shocks. Like this, I have all three holes of the plates in a perfect line and won't have any issues with the position of all three plates. I'm pretty happy with the results so far, so I'm really excited to do the rest of the main landing gear suspension to see the whole suspension work. Then I started to build the shock mounts, which were mounted on the double wishbones. These were my very first parts I laminated with carbon fiber and 24-hour epoxy all on my own, so that was a pretty exciting process. I used 6 layers of carbon fiber. One layer is around 1/4 of a millimeter to reach around 1.5mm thick carbon. I used 6 layers of carbon fiber and the result is what you can see here. To make the template for these carbon mounts, I used some XPS foam. This foam is pretty solid and easy to cut and easy to sand. This is the reason why I chose this foam. It's also the same foam which Mike Patey used to make some carbon parts on his full-scale scrappy build. I had to cut and sand a few parts out of the foam block to shape the perfect design for the template to laminate these parts. Then I assembled the template parts with some UHU Por and used 1.5mm plates to get the right gap between the inlay and the outer shape of the template to make sure that my parts will have 1.5mm thickness. The shape of the template went pretty well, so I added some Vaseline to make it easier to remove the carbon fiber part out of the template after the 24-hour epoxy will be completely cured. Then I cutted all the layers into the right shape and laminated the whole layers into the template, and after all the layers were put into the template, I added the block to get some pressure on the carbon part to avoid having too much epoxy on the parts and make the parts too heavy because of a lot of epoxy. For this I used some foam and some tape, wrapped it all around the template. Like this I was able to squeeze a lot of epoxy excess out of the carbon part. After the epoxy was completely cured, I removed the part out of the template. Removing the carbon part out of the template was surprisingly easy, so the Vaseline solution worked extremely well. I had to clean the carbon part from all the Vaseline, so I took some thinner for the first step of cleaning. Then I cutted the carbon part in a raw shape to see how the carbon looks like and to make it easier to cut it into 2 pieces and into the right shape. To get all the remains of Vaseline out of the carbon part, I used some dishwashing liquid and a brush and did a deep clean of the carbon part to avoid having any Vaseline on the part when I add some epoxy layers later. To improve the finish of the carbon part, I added 3 layers of pure epoxy just to get a nice smooth shape. every layer of epoxy I added, I had to sand it down with 240 sandpaper, and added the second layer and the third layer and did the same step for all the layers. The end result looked pretty good, so I had nice round even edges and flat surfaces, so I was pretty happy with the result of the parts. When you use a brush to put on some epoxy, you have to be careful about loose hair from your brush, so it can happen that some hair are in the epoxy you put on your part. So on the third layer I used a foam instead of a brush. The foam worked also pretty well to add the epoxy, but in the end I still use the brush because it feels more even and I like the surface finish with the brush a bit more. After the surface looked well, I cut it and sanded the parts into the right shape. First I did it with the Dremel, then sanded down with 150 grit and 240 grit sandpaper, and the design looked pretty well. I was really happy with the parts. But then I had the big surprise. This was that the parts were too wide. And the reason why they were too wide is that my digital caliper sometimes shows wrong numbers, and at the moment I did the measurement to get the right width of the carbon mounts, the caliper showed 2 or 3 times the exact same wrong number, and I didn't realize that, and I built the whole parts too wide. But because I liked the parts really how they went out, I didn't want to throw the parts away and make whole new ones, so I decided to try to save the parts and make them just a little narrower and rebuild them with the existing shape. So what I did is I masked the bottom of the carbon parts, marked the center line, and cutted the parts apart, so I was able to sand each side of the part narrower to the exact right width. After this I glued the two parts together again with some 24-hour epoxy, and after the epoxy was cured I added 4 layers of carbon fiber on the inside, on the bottom of the carbon parts to reinforce the carbon parts. And for this I also used some foam which fitted perfectly between the two sides of the carbon mounts. Mixed some epoxy, cut the layers in the right shape, laminated them onto the part and pressed the carbon layers into the carbon part, also with wrapping some tape around the part, and put the whole parts on a metal ruler to get an absolute flat surface. And the end result is what you can see here. So I was extremely surprised how well the repair worked. You can just see a little thin line on the middle which shows where the parts were cut in 2 halves, but in case of strength the parts are really strong, they don't bend at all, so I think the parts will work perfect. I will keep them for the build like this. The finish is not yet done. As you can see, the inside the finish is shiny and on the outside it's matte epoxy, so I will have to do some work on the final finish, but I will do this later during the build. Then I also did some important steps on the tail wheel. So this is the progress so far. You can see here. First steps I did on the adapter, which will connect the tail wheel with the trailing arm. This was a little big and heavy, so I sanded it down to a narrower shape and rounded the rear end to a really nice round shape. To sand it in such a smooth shape, I used a foamy sanding block. used 150 grit sandpaper and sanded down the round shape. The foamy sanding block helps you to get a perfect smooth round shape, and I think the result looks pretty good. Then I made the axle for the tail wheel. For this I used a 2mm screw and a 3mm outer diameter brass tube, which fitted perfectly into the wheel, and some shims to center the wheel perfectly in the wheel clamp. This was a pretty easy step. I just had to cut the 3mm tube, sanded it down to the exact right length to fit the wheel, did a fit check if the tube fits perfectly into the wheel. That was all I had to do for the axle itself. Then it was time to make the custom carbon wheel clamp. This is also hand laminated part. For this I designed a carton template to get the exact round shape I need for the clamp. Did 2 pieces of them, glued them onto XPS foam block and sanded down the foam block to the same round shape of the carton templates. Then added again some Vaseline to make the removing of the carbon part from the template pretty easy. But before I added the Vaseline, I also put some pure epoxy onto the foam template just to make the surface, the round shape, a little stronger, because I had to press the carbon layers onto the round shape and I wanted to avoid dents into the round foam part. The epoxy helped to reinforce the surface of the foam template. Then I had to cut again the layers. This is also 6 layers, so also 1.5mm thick carbon. Added all the layers onto the template, pressed the whole layers onto the round shape so everything looked smooth and clean. After the epoxy was cured, I realized that the surface was pretty dry, so I added another layer of epoxy to really fill up the whole carbon fiber with epoxy and give it a little nicer finish. Unfortunately, I didn't use enough Vaseline for this part, so it was way harder to remove the carbon part from the foam template. I had to take some tools to scratch out the foam out of the carbon part, and also had to sand and clean the inside of the carbon part because there were some remains of foam inside the carbon part. So if you use Vaseline to take apart the carbon and the template, really use enough of Vaseline. You can't go wrong with taking a little more, but if you take not enough, then you will have a hard time to remove the carbon part from the template. After the carbon part was cleaned, I masked the whole part and drawed the raw shape of the wheel clamp onto the part and cutted it out with the Dremel, just the raw shape, sanded it down to a first try how the final shape can look like, put the wheel into the clamp just to see if the shape makes any sense, and I had to sand down a little more, just a little narrower, so the wheel got a little more space in the clamp. The final shape so far is what you can see here. Then I drilled the 2mm hole for the wheel axle. I did this in 2 steps. First step is using a 1mm drill. The reason for this is that the smaller the first drill is, the more exact you can keep the spot where you want to drill your hole. If you take a too big drill, it can move around a little bit on the first drill you make on the carbon part. So first I used a 1mm drill, then a 2mm drill, and to drill the second hole I put the wheel into the clamp, pushed the drill through the brass tube, and like this I could check the wheel position while I was drilling the second hole. So I was sure while drilling that the hole position of the second hole will be in the exact right place. Then I had to drill the hole for the pivot point screw. For this I also had to mask the top side of the clamp, mark the center line, the exact position for the hole. In this case I used a nail to push a tiny hole into the carbon before I started to drill, just because of the round shape of the carbon, which makes it pretty hard with the drill to set it in the exact position to drill. So if you have a little hole made with your awl, it makes it way easier to keep the drill in the exact right position. And I also drilled 1mm, 2mm, then at the end 3mm, which is for the M3 screw. And the fit looks pretty good. It's absolutely free of play. The pivot point has 2 ball bearings in the wheel adapter and the brass tube inside, so everything is free of play and the wheel moves absolutely smooth and easy, no drag at all. So I'm pretty happy with the result so far of the tail wheel. To get a bit the smoother surface of the wheel clamp, I sanded it down a bit with 240 grit sandpaper. This is not the final finish. All the carbon parts do not have the final finish right now, so I will finish the build before I do all the detail work on the finish. So on every carbon part I will add some pure epoxy layers and sand and polish them to give all the parts a really nice smooth finish. So except of the mistake I did on the carbon mounts for the double wishbones, I'm really happy with the progress so far. All the carbon parts, which were my first homemade carbon parts, I'm really happy with the result of them. They are super strong, they are really also lightweight. I'm looking forward to the progress on the trailing arm, so I'm coming closer and closer to the whole build of the tail wheel suspension. This is it for today's video. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a good time. See you in the next one. Bye bye.